Hey crew, Coach Josh here with GarageGangGyms.com, and today we're talking about belts. So first thing we want to talk about with belts is why do we use them? So we use them to add rigidity to our midsection when lifting, typically for lower body type exercises and overhead type exercises. Some people do benefit depending upon how they arch in a bench, but that's beyond what we're going to talk about today. This is meant to add rigidity and stability into the softer parts of our body. So it is not to cover up back pain. Can it prevent you from feeling pain? Sure, but so could just having more core tension. Now, if you feel you have back pain, a belt is just putting a band-aid on it. Chances are you need to learn how to brace your core better. You need to work on some stiffness that you may have. Maybe your positions on your lift is wrong, and that's causing you to have that back pain. Or, of course, you've been injured, accident, things like that. This is not going to make that problem go away. This is only going to allow some people to lift more weight. And if you're lifting more weight with the same problems, chances of you injuring yourself or re-injuring yourself can go up. So that brings up a great point. Not everybody benefits from a belt. Now, they would benefit from the pressure that it would give them, but for some people, it's not comfortable to wear. It actually gets in their head and they don't like wearing a belt, and therefore they don't actually lift more weight. There are world records in both weightlifting and powerlifting set by people who don't wear a belt. So you don't have to, but you may benefit from it. Now, the belt you see in my hand here is actually a foam belt. I like using a foam belt. You could certainly use a leather belt. A leather belt is going to be more stiff, assuming it's not 1,000 years old. It's going to be more stiff than this, but for my sport, I have to be at the bottom of a squat when racking a weight, and having something really stiff makes it really hard for me to get into position. But if you're just a typical fitness goer, you could benefit from a leather belt. You could benefit from a foam belt as well. So let's talk about size. Now, as I said before, we're trying to add rigidity to the softness in our body. So this is a 4-inch belt. Most people, this is the type of belt that you're going to use. Now, the reason it works for me is where my ribs, or at least my more stiff ribs, end and my hips start, there's more than 4 inches of space between there. And that way, when I put the belt in that zone, I'm not having the belt fold over any of my bones. It's essentially adding a layer of bone to my body. So if you are in a store, and I highly recommend you go to a store just to kind of check out different sizes. If you're in a store and you just lay it against you and you feel it touching your hips, let's say, or touching really high into your ribs, that belt itself might be too thick for you. Again, this is a 4-inch belt. And if you are more of a leg type person and have a shorter torso, or for smaller women, they typically benefit from a 3-inch belt. Now, there are plenty of belts out there, plenty of styles out there. And just to kind of go over some of the basics, the thicker the belt oftentimes means the more rigid it can be, or it's going to be. Based on the type of clasp that you have, I'm just using a typical clasp here. If you have a 1-prong, it's going to be less stable than a 2-prong clasp. If you have a ratchet, it's going to be more stable and more adjustable than even a 2-prong, because with the 2-prong, you're limited by where the holes are on that belt, where when you're using Velcro like this or one of those ratchet belts, you can actually get the perfect size for you. Now, when you're figuring out what size you need, our goal is to get the thickest parts of these belts almost touching. For some people, it will touch, but the worst thing that could happen is overlap. If it overlaps, it's too thick, okay? And it's going to be really hard for you to take a breath, because our goal with a belt is to brace our core exactly how we would if we were lifting without the belt. Now, some people are going to push back on that. Some people benefit from completely changing how they add pressure into their core, but that's beyond what we're going to talk about here. I want you, with or without a belt, to brace exactly the same. The belt just happens to give you a little bit more pressure. So again, we don't want it to overlap. We also don't want a belt that's too far apart, because then this is all soft. Imagine if I had that belt on and this is all the further it came in. There's so much softness in here that we're not getting a whole lot from the belt. So again, when the belt is actually on and it's tight, we want a little bit of distance, but not a ton. Now, some belts are straight belts like this. Most competitive belts are required to be straight like this. Some do what's called taper, the bigger in the back and they taper to the front. If you're just the typical gym goer, I recommend you get whatever belt is most comfortable for you and it makes you feel safe. But again, some of those belts that taper are really tall in the back, 6, 7 inches. They're really tall. Just make sure that it's only covering the softness of your body, right? So let's talk about putting on our belt and how to brace with it. Now, your belt might be a little different. Mine actually has this little extra clip in here. And the nice thing about that, if you're thinking Velcro, I highly recommend a 2-poot or knockoffs of a 2-poot because of this extra piece in here. The reason being is when you loop it through, the cool thing about it is rather than the weak spot being the Velcro, the weak spot's going to be this clasp here itself. And the nice thing about that is I've owned belts where it doesn't have this. And as you're lifting, because all of the tension is stored in that Velcro, there is a chance or a tendency for that belt to let go while you're in the middle of a lift. And nothing throws you off more than a belt that wants to drop to the floor. Okay, so let's talk about putting the belt on, how we breathe, how we brace. So I'm going to turn sideways for you so you can see this. What I always do is I always pull the belt against my lower back first, okay? Because I'm trying to get it as flat on my body as I can. From there, once it's tight up against my lower back, then I'm going to flatten it across my midsection, okay? From there, trying to keep it flat, and you'll see me using my finger here, trying to keep it flat, I'll put a little bit of tension on my belt. So it's nice, tight, and flat. Then I'm going to take the same breathing and brace that I would do without the belt. So I'm going to try to keep my shoulders down. I'm going to try to rapidly expand my core as much as I can with my breath. I'm also going to let some air get into my lungs so that I take in as much air as I can. I'm going to hold my breath for a moment and then I'm going to latch this down a little bit. So I'm pulling the belt. I take my rapid inhale and then I'll cinch it down a little bit. Now, when I'm cinching it down, for me, I only cinch it down half an inch, maybe. Because what I'm doing is when I breathe in rapidly, my body's already trying to contract against that air, right? And then that belt is just going to help me contract a little bit more. But the reason I only do a little instead of going up against the rack, leveraging it over or ratchet, is because the tighter you make the belt, the less able you are to take a full breath before you lift. Now, if you're the type that you're standing there, you get it a big, super deep breath, you lock it down, and then your goal is just to keep that pressure, maybe walk up to a deadlift and pull it without needing to take a breath, great. Then you can put a little bit more tension on it. But if you're like me, I like to put it on and maybe 10, 15 seconds will go by before I'm unracking the bar, squatting it, before I'm pulling that deadlift. And I need to take a few breaths. And if it's too tight, I can't take a good enough breath. And that actually makes me susceptible to getting injured, is if I can't get enough expansion, then the belt's actually working against me or against you. So again, I'm going to take that breath, tight, pull it just a little bit tighter. And then when I relax, I can put my hand in just a little bit, a few fingers in there. It's still very firm against me. I could certainly lift like this. But then when I'm taking that good breath and bracing, the belt is actually going to push against me as I'm breathing in, and it's going to keep tension as I'm going. Because what a lot of people miss when they're breathing or bracing is they miss the fact that you actually want a little bit of tension in your core before you breathe and while you breathe, okay? So that belt's actually going to help you provide a little bit of tension so that as you're breathing in, your body's already trying to contract against this air, and that air is making your muscles stretch, and your body's like, no, 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 no. And that's also why breathing in rapidly and taking in as much volume in as short of a period of time as you can is so important, is because if we think of your abdominal cavity as just muscle, right? Muscle, if it extends or stretches slowly, it has less of a desire to come back aggressively, right? So if we take a really slow inhale, we're not going to have a whole lot of stored tension, right? That muscle is actually just going to stretch and relax, rather than what we want is a fast inhalation that's going to cause those muscles to stretch really rapidly, boom, and then our body says, what the hell? And it clenches back down. So we're kind of using our own reflexes to help us brace and get more pressure that way. So that's talking belts. Now let's see what it looks like when I use a belt on squats. Okay, putting the belt on. Everything's the same. Taking my breath, bracing, doing everything the same. And I'm going to breathe and brace the exact same way as me putting my belt on. I'm leaving a little bit of looseness so that when I brace and latch it down, I can still breathe. So let's get there first. Okay, still a little bit of looseness. I'm going to breathe, I'm going to brace, put as much tension through my body as I can. The belt's going to help me do that a little bit. Here we go. So there you go, guys. That's how I use my belt and how I teach my athletes to use their belt when they're lifting. We brace exactly the same way. We only clench it down just a little bit so we get extra pressure. We can still get to our depth when we're squatting, as you saw. We're still able to hold a nice rigid spine when we deadlift. And if you guys like videos like this, or my deep dive videos, or my instructional videos, my nutrition videos, please drop a like, hit that subscribe button, because I love coming out with content for you guys, and every like motivates me more to do better. This is Coach Josh with GarageGangGyms.com. I'll see you next time.